Ask a young person what they want to do in the future, and often the response will be, I want to help people. This is a good aim, but it can be hard to know what to actually do in a real practical sense. Traditionally, it could be a push to become one of these helping professions, a teacher, a doctor, a nurse. These are jobs that help people directly, and you can see the results sometimes. With that said, I don't think you need to be in one of these traditionally helping careers in order to have a real meaningful impact on the world. And I want to be clear here that my goal here today is not to compare the moral worthiness of different careers. In fact, for the purpose of today, let's assume the job you have is irrelevant, as long as it's not a completely morally reprehensible job. And the reason why I say that is pretty much any traditional job that gives you a stable income can be switched into something that can have a real meaningful impact on the world in a measurable and practical way. And I think you'll be surprised that the way to do that is surprisingly mundane. And one of the best ways to do it is through charities. Now, I know that when I mention the word charities, there's a part of us that kind of becomes a little bit more skeptical. To be honest, I think charities actually get a bit of a bad rap in a bit of a paradoxical way. I think there's a part of us that knows they're likely a good thing that potentially has a good impact on the world. But there's also the more rational part of us that kind of holds back a little bit because we're worried about, maybe they're spending money on too much advertising. How do we know that they have a real proper impact? Understandably, there's hesitancy there, and that's enough to kind of not contribute to charities, not out of malice necessarily, but more out of uncertainty and a kind of paralysis that comes from that. Now, something that I think isn't really spoken about much is just how much good some of these charities are, keyword being some. And from what I can see from looking at good charities is that often the best ones are ones that focus on a very specific intervention with very measurable outcomes. By monitoring their results in a really strict way, they can work out if what they're doing is actually having a benefit on the world or not, because often these things aren't as intuitive as we'd like. And some of these charities are so good at monitoring and also being transparent with their findings that they can actually work out through these sort of external charity evaluators how much money will actually save a person's life, which is a very kind of abstract way to think. These are statistical lives that we're not seeing, but these, from their assessment, from the numbers, we can work out exactly how much of an impact. And today we'll look at one of these options, which is the Against Malaria Foundation. And I'll come back to how we can sort of incorporate this into our work and making a meaningful impact through that. Now, malaria still kills about 600,000 people annually, and most of these people are in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of these people are children under the age of 5. One of the best ways to reduce malaria deaths is by preventing the transmission from happening. Mosquitoes carry malaria, and when they bite people, that's when malaria goes into the body. Because of that, mosquito nets are actually shown to be, what the evidence shows us, is that they're one of the best ways to prevent that transmission. So essentially what it looks like is a malaria net will hang over a person, over a family. People will sleep under those nets and they'll prevent mosquitoes from biting them while they're sleeping. And because of how good AMF's monitoring and transparency is, we can actually measure the effectiveness of their approach in a real empirical way. So considering everything about their process, getting these insecticide nets, the logistics of getting a net to the people who need it, the cost of that whole process for one net is about $6, which is very efficient. Unfortunately, smarter people than me have estimated that for every $5,500, that would likely produce one life saved. This is a lot of money. When it comes to saving a life, it's quite cheap, but it's still a lot of money. One of my favorite thought experiments comes from this philosopher, Peter Singer, who gives us another way to sort of think about this whole charitable giving thing. And he writes a lot about this idea. So let's say you're wearing a nice suit, you're walking past a fairly shallow pond, and then you see a child drowning in that pond. You could jump into the pond. Your suit's going to get wrecked, but you'll save the child. It's a fairly shallow pond, so you're pretty confident. The other option is you walk past, you don't want to muck up your suit, and you let the child drown. And I think it's kind of a funny example, and you might feel the same, because the answer is so clear to us. It's intuitive. Of course we would jump in. Of course we'd save the child. Of course we'd accept that our suit is wrecked. Then the next question becomes, what if that child was drowning, in another country, but for whatever reason, you can sacrifice your suit and save a child's life? Should we let geographical distance change our decision making? Probably not. And of course, it doesn't make sense that you're able to sacrifice your suit and then save a child's life. But you kind of can. And I think it raises a really intuitive question. If we're willing to sacrifice a suit, say it's $5,500, to save a child's life, and we're willing to do that and it's almost intuitive, what does that mean for charitable giving? And I think this simple thought experiment really raises a fairly complex question with how we view money. And so if we're working a regular job, by donating a portion of the income made over the long term, even if it's a small portion, the impact can be so significant to the point where you can genuinely save a life. That's not even exaggeration. That's what the numbers tell us. One particular movement that really takes this seriously is the Giving What We Can pledge. And essentially this is a non-binding pledge, but it encourages people to donate a self-defined portion of their income regularly to effective charities. And this is how you can transform any job, whether it's your future job, your current job. You can transform it into something that genuinely benefits the world in a real, meaningful and measurable way. And the Against Malaria Foundation is far from the only organisation that works this efficiently. There are so many more that present similar results. That means that anyone with a job that is providing a level of financial stability, by donating a portion of your income, you can provide malaria nets, increase vaccination rates, improve vitamin A supplementation. There's so many interventions that have such efficient ways of acting and measurable results that you can see and you can read about, that it can make any job into something meaningful. And if we take that fact really seriously, any job can become one that helps. So with that in mind, I'm going to follow my own advice and we're going to keep going with this 120 per week donation to the Against Malaria Foundation. In future videos, we'll have a look at some of the other effective charities and maybe switch up our donation direction from there. But I think it's you know, a part of me hesitates in being so public with donations and charitable giving, because it's definitely inbuilt into me, and I think many others, to not be too kind of to be modest when it comes to charitable giving. But you know, reading about these charities and the idea of normalizing charitable giving, it becomes important to actually be public about these things and normalize it and make it more common rather than, you know, seen as something that a particularly moral person has to do. My goal is to make charitable giving much more normal, I suppose, which is a hard thing to do. But I think the first step is to be sort of public about the donations we give. So I'd encourage you to have a similar kind of setup with your income, and I'll encourage you to be public with the people around you as well, as hard as it is. So yeah. Anyway, that's all for the video. Bit of a stream of consciousness, but we'll see you again in the next one.